it is 6 o'clock, so we can begin. And as people drop in, they can join anytime they like. Welcome, everybody. Hi, how is everyone? I hope things are okay. I'm actually so surprised and so grateful to see so many people have been able to join. It's really a very devastating time. It's absolutely tragic, and in this horror, to see that people have taken time out to be here today, I'm so grateful. And all I can say is that I hope that we can offer you some sort of solace, some quietude, at least for an hour, away from all the noise and all the absolute mess that's outside and inside. And if anything, I hope it's at least better than watching the exit polls. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here, for The Poet and the City, reading Eunice De Souza and Bombay. I, for one, am very excited because we have Melanie Silgardo and Paromita Vohra here with us today to talk about the poet, the city, poetry, Bombay, and all the various relationships that exist between the two. So thank you so much. Eunice De Souza, of course, needs no introduction, but if I were to just remember her legacy and pay respect to her, there are some things I want to say. Eunice De Souza was born in 1940 in Pune. She was a poet, a critic, a professor of English, and the head of department at St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. She's published various collections of poetry. Fix in 1979, of course, was published by Melanie Silgardo and Santan Rodrigues and Rahul de Gama Rose at Newground. Her other books of poems, Women in Dutch Painting, 9 Indian Women Poets, Necklace of Skulls, These My Words is a poetry anthology co-edited with Melanie. And she was, of course, the editor of another anthology, Early Indian Poetry in English, which includes poetry from 1829 to 1947. So an otherwise underrepresented collection of poetry is highlighted in that remarkable anthology, which I recommend everybody read. And then, sorry, just give me a minute. Yeah, and then of course her book Talking Poems is a fantastic book for anybody who's interested in the Indian poets of the time, because it includes interviews with so many of them, so many of whom were elusive figures who were not very much in the limelight. So it's a fantastic collection of dialogue that I highly recommend. And of course, we were just talking about her weekly column at Mumbai Mirror, which had a fan base of its own. So there were many hats that Eunice wore, and I'm sure so many more. Personally, of course, there is so much that Eunice has influenced me with. There is her poetry. For the first time, there was a radical shift in the type of poetry that was being written and produced in the subcontinent, in the literary world. Her poems are known for being sharp and succinct. She's known for her remarkable control and economy of words. And of course,
It's also come down to it, but whether that will be enough.
I'm going to mute the people. I'm so sorry for this. So her economy of words and the control over language that she had is something that I think all students of poetry constantly learn from and are inspired by. There's so much more to say about it, how she uses her evocative, sardonic voice to comment upon the Catholic community in Bombay in which she was raised, the experiences of being a woman, of being critiqued, or being criticized as a woman poet. There's so much to unpack in her poetry, and I'm sure Melanie has much more insightful things to say than I. So I'm going to stop there. But I am so honored to have this opportunity to spend an hour with Eunice's poetry, and I think the number of people here with us today in this terrible time is just a testament to how her poetry has stayed for so many years. Hi, Melanie. Hi, Paromita. I want to introduce the both of you, two fantastic people we have today. Melanie Silgardo is a poet and an editor. She co-founded New Ground Press in the 70s with Rahul de Gama Rose and Santan Rodrigues, and they published Fix, which was Eunice De Souza's first book of poems in 1979. Melanie was Eunice's student, publisher, co-editor, and friend. In 1985, her book of poems, Skies of Design, won the Asian section of the Best First Book Commonwealth Poetry Prize. And she's greatly contributed to poetry in Bombay, in the subcontinent. Even Ranjit Hoskote had said that she's one of the pioneers of Indian poetry in English. Personally, I keep going back to your poems, Melanie, especially Bombay and the Earthworm Story. There's so much said about, there's so many comparisons made about your poetry with Eunice's, and people have talked about how your poems are energized with vocabulary of violence and natural elements. But for me, the energy is what interacts with me as a reader. So it's something that keeps me going back. So thank you so much. I am so honored to have you here today. And then, of course, we have Paromita Vohra, who is so well known. She's a filmmaker, writer, cultural commentator. She's known for her popular documentaries. She won an award for the screenplay that she wrote for Khamosh Pani. She is the director of Paro Devi Pictures and also the creative director of Agents of Ishq, which is a platform for positive communication about sex, sexuality, queerness, gender, love, ishq, mohabbat, and all the rest. And of course, her weekly column in Midday has a fan base of its own. There are parallels to draw with Eunice De Souza and her column, her weekly column. I actually first read your writing, Paromita, when I read Bombay Meri Jaan, writings on Mumbai. And I was immediately drawn to your story because of its, because of how it explored the private, domestic, yet public and gendered urban space of Bombay. So really, there's so much exciting stuff to talk about. We're going to be talking about Eunice De Souza, Bombay, her poetry, and everything in between. So I have talked more than enough. I'm going to hand it over to you, Melanie. If you could please talk to us about how you read Eunice De Souza's poetry. Of course, you've been associated with her for so many years. So if you could tell us about how you read her writing, what is striking for you about her poetry, her poetics, please.
Saranya, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure. And thank you for that glowing introduction. I'm sure I in no way deserve it, but all the same. And I want to thank everyone for Zooming in. What a terrible time this is. And I really hope that your families and loved ones are safe and well. And if not, that they can get access to the help that they need. So thank you again for attending this. Eunice De Souza. Eunice De Souza has been a big figure in my life. I first met her when I was a feckless student of 18, and I was switching colleges from Sophia to Xavier's, I hoped. I'd got terrible grades because at Sophia I'd spent more time outside the classroom than inside it, and it was time for a new leaf story for me. My interview at Xavier's at the English department was with Nisha De Cunha and Eunice De Souza. And as I fibbed and faltered through my interview, Nisha kept looking more and more dubious, and Eunice was nodding encouragingly, I think more at my enthusiasm than anything else. And I tell this story because for me, that first meeting with Eunice was important in the way I came to understand her as I got to know her better. Because under the carapace of fierceness was an empathy, a huge generosity, a vulnerability, and integrity, uh, um, uh, um, all attributes that permeated her work as I came to know it, and her poetic practice. The irony provided the distance that she needed. In her introduction to 9 women poets, which you've talked about, Saranya, she says, our poetic ancestors are not necessarily those who come just before our time, by which I think she meant she wasn't looking to Sarojini Naidu for her as her influence. But she went back further to the hymns in the Vedas and the Bhakti poets and the oral folk traditions to find her genetic poetic heritage. She found their voices direct, witty, congenial, domestic rebels, many of them. Other poets, that influenced her were Eliot and Auden, 19th century poets such as Robert Browning. She always referenced one of his poems, To My Last Duchess, a dramatic and disturbing monologue, which said more by omission than inclusion, which very much was the way Eunice wrote her poetry. She was very much, to me, a less is more kind of poet. And then Gerard Manley Hopkins was another big influence. His sort of tormented transcendentalism. She references a word that he uses, a composite word that he uses in a poem, Jack Self, in her Songs of Survival. Jack Self, I can bludgeon you no more, she says. And while many of her poems are about self, they're about self as universal, as political, as restorative, as surviving, as about finding the order in things and restoring it. Dissonance and finding harmony and meaning. For instance, in her poem Conversation Piece, she says, my Portuguese colleague picked up a clay Shiva lingam one day and said, is this an ashtray? No, said the salesman, this is our God. It is a sort of a Mobius strip of a poem, with an infinite loop of cultural misunderstanding and correction. And, and Eunice's poems, many of them touch on that. Her poems are eloquent and full of poignancy, whether she's talking about the inadequacies of lovers or life as an independent woman living alone. In one poem, she says, sometimes we compare notes. I talk about the parrots. She talks about her children. She tells me little Kay cries for effect. If I get home after dark, I tell her, they look at me with sad, reproachful eyes. So she found parallels everywhere. And writing poetry was one way she had of confronting her demons. Her father's death when she was 3 affected her deeply. And it's a recurring theme in her poems. Her own death preoccupied her in the last decade of her life. And like everything else, she wanted to look it in the eye. Tell me, Mr. Death, time, date, place. Her journey from fix, the searing poems, to learn from the almond leaf, gently poised elegiac poems, was an arc bending towards her own version of her personal enlightenment through poetry. I would like to read a couple of poems before moving on to talk about Eunice and Bombay. And this poem I see as a quintessentially Bombay poem by Eunice. It's called Landscape. M assures me she'll be back to fling my ashes in the local creek. We're short on sacred rivers here. The pungent air will suit my soul. It will find its place among the plastic carrier bags and rags that float upstream. Or is it downstream? One can never tell. The sea sends everything reeling back. The trees go under. We push so much under the carpet. The carpet's now a landscape, a worm embedded in each tuft. There's a forest moving. Everybody smiles and smiles. The crows never learn. There is garbage enough for everyone. The mouths of the young are raw red, soundless. The egret alights on the topmost branch. Not a leaf is disturbed on all sides, the ocean. Stretch marks of the city. Look the other way. There are dhows there, Arab horses for desert kingdoms. An old monkey coughs in a tree. The young sense food, jump from rock to burning rock. We bar windows and doors, cower, nursing warm beer. An eagle hovers on a branch split by lightning. Eunice grew up in Pune, but as an adult, Bombay became her stomping ground. In the early days of our friendship, she introduced me to everything I came to know and love: the silver markets, Chor Bazaar, the handicraft stores. We would go browsing in Khadi Bandar and cottage industries. Some of these places don't exist as they did in the 70s. And for years, she wrote an arts column for the Economic Times. This predated her Mumbai Mirror column by years. And I would traipse along with her to art exhibitions at the Jahangir, the Kemul, the Pandol. She introduced me to contemporary Indian painting in a way that I'd never known it. Amrita Shergill and Akbar Padamsi and Vivan Sundaram, Bhupen Khakkar, Newton Souza. And the proximity of, at the end of the day, was so close to the Taj that it was difficult to resist going to the Sea Lounge and having a cold glass of beer before one had to fortify oneself for the long journey home by train. And Eunice was a Bombay poet insofar as where she lived and loved and located her psyche. Bombay in the 70s and 80s was bursting with poets and poetic enterprise. I remember a poster a student of Eunice's had made for one of the poetry readings we organized at Xavier's. It said, "You can't swing a cat, you might hit a poet." That just about summarized the city. There was Arun Kolatkar, who you could find on a designated weekday, discussing and debating with other like-minded people at the Wayside Inn in Kalagoda over a red and white gingham tablecloth, or Adil Jasawala, whose flattened cuff parade was where writers gathered, not always by appointment, to exchange views and news and gossip, or Nissim Ezekiel, ever the facilitator and mentor of new poets, be spotted on the university campus, or Kamla Das at her soirees, many of which I attended, where she was either alarmingly present or alarmingly absent, or Santan Rodriguez at his central bank office, where he also edited Kavi, the small and influential poetry magazine in his lunch hour. Magazines such as Kavi and Poetry India, which Nissim edited, were important, very important for the time, because they published both Indian poetry in English and translations, which gave Indian poetry in many ways sort of equitable status. It was one of Eunice's bugbear that Indian poetry was considered by many critics in the languages not to be Indian poetry at all. And in fact, she dedicated her entire PhD thesis to challenging this agenda. And I wish I'd known that Bombay would become such an important focus in the 70s and 80s. I always say to myself, if I'd known, I would have kept a diary, because things are a bit sort of fuzzy from time to time. But I'd like to end this segment with another poem of Eunice's, also one that encapsulates everything that Eunice was about, how she felt about the world and how she responded to it. It's called Return. It's a poem she wrote on her return from a few months in England, where she'd met writers and attended conferences. Return. The old wrought iron gate has gone, and the tall tangled grass and the mosquitoes. The priest is chanting his blessings on the stone of the new building. Squirrels chase each other up and down the 2 mango trees left standing. My neighbors want to know, did I enjoy? Thinking of the old wrought iron gate and the cotton tree that managed only 1 flower every summer, I agree. Perhaps enjoyment should have no object. It was the sound of the Chennai in a London flat that brought me scurrying back to catch this train, to be again among these old hills, stray bougainvillea, and the peasant women with only a handful of berries to sell. I covet the presence your home has. I want to be like that, cool, dark, subterranean. There I would not covet even you, grudge your many loves, or even write you more love poems. Sarala Devi, Kusumbala, Rani Devi, all of ill fame. I read your story in the morning paper. You refuse to wear ankle bells, worn for generations. You study law. You hear catcalls in the street, drums and bells behind your books. Sitting alone in a Bombay restaurant, listening to the innuendos of college clerks and a loose-lipped Spanish priest, I know something of how you feel. Dukkha, forgive my familiarity. I have loved your pithy verses ever since that French priest, everyone thought mad, recited them and told us of his journey with your people. They have broken down whole streets of houses in Pandapur to widen the road to the shrine. The priests do not sound like you, but I'll offer a coconut anyway for someone I love. You made life hard for your wife, and I'm not sure I approve of that. Nor did you heed her last request. Come back soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for reading them and also for sharing your insights and your own experiences. And I was just noticing as you were reading the poems that it is one thing to read Eunice De Souza's poems, because I think reading them for me is an experience because of all the, excuse me, sorry. Whoever is unmuted, please, I request the audience to mute themselves. Thank you. Yes, So while reading her poems is one experience, because I noticed the spaces and the way her words are on the onomatopoeia that she uses in her words that create a lyrical quality. There is a rhythm to these seemingly bare sentences, and I think that's what really enriches them. But to hear you read them really makes me wonder at how it has both an amazing quality to listen to. So really, thank you so much. And these are splendid poems. Can I ask why you chose these in particular?
Return I chose because, as I said, it encapsulates Eunice's worldview that is reflected in her poems, right from her return to the city to her comments about women who she connects with, who've challenged their backgrounds, her feminism, right to her influences, of the poetry of Tuka, who she was a great admirer of.
Yeah. And you said so much about Bombay at the time. I mean, there are so many locations that you mentioned that that are carried in her work. You have St. Xavier's and the areas in Crawford, and what was it that you had said? The market areas that are not the same.
The markets in Zaveri Bazaar and
Bazaar.
Tor Bazaar.
Yes.
Yeah. Was a great shopper.
Yes, well, these are places that are made for shopping, and there is so much to buy in the city. And there's so much. The city has changed so much over the years, but I'm also so curious about that very specific time and place in which she was writing, which is why I now kindly hand over the floor to Paromita. If you could tell us about this very unique time, right? The second half of the 20th century, Bombay, there was suddenly, like that poem said, you kick a cat and you hit a poet, something along those lines, Melanie, you had read.
No, it was a poster that's a student admitted, because there were so many poets around at the time. You can't swing a cat. You might hit a poet.
Yeah. I apologize for kicking a cat. Don't kick cats. But so there's so much to be said about this very specific time. And Paramita, can you tell us something about the culture in which Eunice is writing and this city?
So, I mean, first of all, I don't really feel like speaking after listening to Melanie speak, because I'm feeling full with listening to her and to the readings. And the other thing is, I suppose I can't authoritatively speak for the time, because I'm old, but not that old yet. So it's not like I was like a young thing around town at that time. But I do think that, when I came to Bombay, I was 20 years old, and it was just at the tail end of that time. So I think, I think I would talk a little bit about discovering the city and discovering poetry about the city in an intertwined way, because I think Melanie has alluded to so many of the things which, it's not just about nostalgia that some of those things are lost. Like they are genuine truths about economic changes and cultural changes in the city, right? But I remember, so I always came to Bombay as a child because my mother's from Bombay. My grandmother lived in Bandra. And as a child, you don't traverse the whole city, right? You always stay close to, you have a very limited map of the city. And so there would be rare times when you would go to South Bombay, and you always knew you reached South Bombay when you crossed Haji area, and then there was red and white awnings at Hirapanna Center. And then you're like, okay, now we're in town, as it was called, right? And then you'd go to Haj. Like if some rich uncle was visiting and we'd go visit them, which I wrote about in the story that you read. Right? So when I came as a grown-up to study, and I went to, and I'd heard that you can go and buy secondhand books on the street, and that, going to town for the day was a thing that you did because it was full of all the pleasures that Melanie alluded to, which is, I mean, as I was listening to her describe Eunice, I thought like there is a reason why we sometimes feel attracted to certain artists, because it's not only about the emotional landscape, but there are so many sensory things that we love which are the same. Like I am a die-hard shopper and I own many things from many bazaars around the world, right? And I love small bazaars. So the whole thing of like going to Fort and Fountain, or and looking at the at browsing books on the street, um, saving up your money and going, like I discovered Wayside Inn just walking past it, right? Like, so that first of all, the adventure of being a grown up and being on your own in the city. I think it's always an unparalleled experience for everybody, but perhaps because Bombay was a city of such, it emblematized this kind of freedom, a grown-upness, and I think what is called cosmopolitan, but I think it was a romanticized city, you know, and so you were in the middle of the romance. It was a cinematic experience to walk in the city and amongst these Gothic buildings. And when I saw the Wayside Inn for the first time, I thought, can this be a real place? Like, am I dreaming? Because it was so quaint, right? And I remember going in there and like ordering whatever was cheapest, probably because I was a student. And I think what poetry did then, in a way, is suddenly it reflects all of those experiences which you are having, because suddenly then, you know, later knowing that Arun Kolatkar is writing about Wayside Inn, or know, or glimpsing your Catholic teacher from school in some syntax or something that Eunice has written, or Ezekiel is writing, that actually brings alive your own experience of the city, uh, which seems to you to be entirely random, secret, and subjective. But then suddenly you realize, no, it binds me to an entire milieu, and a kind of huge, I don't know, it's a community of feeling. It's not necessarily a community of any other kind, right? And I think the other thing that is very notable about the time that I certainly received some of the end of is this mixing of languages. You know, the thing that idea that Indian poetry in English is something separate, as opposed to being one of many poetries in India, and to receive all of those things together, like for me.
Hello, Jayashree. ಒಂದು ಡನ್ ಸ್ಪೀಕಿಂಗ್ வருது மைக்ரோஃபோன் இஸ் அன்மியூட்டட் இருக்கு. நான் மியூட்.
Okay, I'm going to mute. Okay, yeah. So
காது கேக்குறதா பாக்க.
Okay. I don't know who else needs to be muted, but yeah. So I think that you know, like for example, Narayan Surve was a poet that I came to know because of places I was going to and people I was meeting and poetry I was reading. Or Sudhir Patwardhan, who is a painter, not a poet, but was also somebody that I knew of, or Atul Dodia. It was something that seemed to be there in the air, in the culture, that allowed you to make a connection to the city, and to connect your own experiences to the experiences of other people who lived in the city. And those people were not only people like yourself. And I think that was kind of a very important, a very, very dramatic and dramatic truth about Bombay, which is Bombay's own poetry in a way. The fact that your experiences were intertwined with a diverse kind of community of people. You may or may not have direct friendships with them. Sometimes you did have direct friendships with people who are very different from you. And so in a sense, it was a poetic experience of intersectionality, at least at the suggestive sense. You understood that your experience joined you and also separated you from a large and complex population in the city. I think the way that Bombay, I mean, of course, Bombay was always seen as a very professional and commercial city and all of those things. But Bombay is also a city in which every individual is a kind of poem, right? I mean, we all come into the city to remake ourselves in some ways. And I think that Bombay was, it still is, but more so was full of people who were coming and reshaping the city just by the lives that they led. And in that sense, I think, you know, I think about hearing about Eunice from my classmates. So I didn't really know Eunice's poetry and I had not heard of her, but I had classmates who had been her students. And they were so, what can I say? They were so they were scared of her, right? Because she didn't seem to suffer fools gladly. And so I'd heard that she could be very sarcastic, and it was both thrilling and terrifying for the students. So I was very fascinated by the idea of Eunice before I actually even knew her poems. And I remember buying Fix at Strand bookstall. I remember taking it out. There used to be that little shelf on the side where all the poetry was. So I also think like how amazing the little magazines that were there in Marathi, the poetry that was being printed and published, which you would just happen upon and read. And because maybe, you know, this was a thing that you did. You went to town, you went to new and secondhand books, you went to Strand, then you roamed to buy some old records. This was the kind of like tafri that you did when you went to Bombay. So all of that became like it fed into, and this genealogy of existence, right? That actually also what Melanie said, that your poetic ancestors are all over the place actually. So I think that so I remember taking out the book and looking at that photograph and that cover and being so struck by it and thinking like, this is very cool. I don't know what it is, but I kind of feel it calling to me, you know, that sort of thing. So I think that there were many ways in which the history of like Eunice's life is part of the history of the city, right? The way that she was a figure that influenced so many students, and that people understood as being part of what it meant to be in Bombay. And I think that we don't tell these histories all that much, right? I mean, I think that cities don't only make people the way that people say that you'll come to Bombay and make your fortune. I mean, people make the city what it is by the lives that they lead and by the possibilities they present. Um, I think I think also as a woman and an artist, like not a teacher alone, but as a woman and an artist, Eunice represented something very quintessentially possible, not only in Bombay, but a Bombay version of it, right? Like I think women artists don't get described often enough in terms of just their wholeness. And in this present time, which is very distinct from then, I feel all the more we are hemmed in by being defined as what it means to be a liberated person, right? Like, so we get presented these templated ideas of feminism and this templated idea of what you can be. Like, can you be a victim? Can you be badass? Can you be bold? It's all this kind of like very cliched repertoire of types that you're supposed to fit into and then just tick the box of liberation. Whereas we all know that liberation is something very complicated, very racking, very painful often, but also glorious. And I think we find all of those things in Eunice's poems, and that's what attracted me. I mean, it's not like I know all of Eunice's work, but I know this thing, right? And that this thing that we find in poetry, which is all our different selves, I think you don't find a lot of poets doing that, taking a big bite out of life, which in a sense a city like Bombay encourages you to do, and then just giving it to you in these fantastic, pithy, you know, dry poems. So I'm going to actually show you, I want to read a little thing that I wrote about Eunice, but I want to show you a little clip from a film where Eunice read one of her poems before I talk about this thing of being a Bombay girl in a way, or what Bombay allows, Bombay girls rather. Yeah. So I'm going to share. So this is from a film I made called Where's Sandra, which is about this idea of Sandra from Bandra. And I interviewed Eunice in it. Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's all clear. Yes.
You can't say they didn't try. Mamas never mentioned menses. Screamed, you vulgar girl, don't say brassiers, say bracelets. She pinned paper sleeves onto our sleeveless dresses. The preacher thundered, never go with a man alone, never alone. And even if you're engaged, only passionless kisses. At 16, Phoebe asked me, can it happen when you're in a dance hall? I mean, you know what? Getting preggers and all that. When you're dancing. I, 16, assured her you could.
So, I mean, I think like, you know, this poem is, sorry, yeah. Melanie, you're saying something?
I said that's wonderful to see that clip.
Yeah. I'll send you the link to the film so you can
Yeah,
watch it.
please.
So, and you know, the sort of film, I mean, of course, in the film, Eunice speaks in a limited way to the topic of the film, which is this representation of Catholic girls as either very fast or very dowdy and very religious, and, you know, what lies between. But for me, I had wanted to make this film about the Sandra from Bandra idea, because for me, it's a fantastic idea. For me, it was an idea of possibility that as a kid, when I would go into an office and there were secretaries, or if I saw somebody in a dress, and then in Hindi films, you always saw this other Bombay, like of women, you know, who, according to me, were the girls who unlike the girl who got the guy, they were they were never crying, right? Like the heroine of the film was always crying, but the girls in the dresses were always having a good time. So I was very attracted to them in movies and also in life. so, so I think, but when you hear this poem, I mean, there is that. It's not just that the poem is about young girls going to school and that world of the convent school in a way that I too was part of, but it's also the the sharpness and the sweetness with which Eunice is describing that moment, right? Like the sweetness of, I mean, there's a kind of teasing uh, of the young people being very sure that this is what happens, a kind of dryness which was very quintessentially Eunice, the tenderness, but also wit, the enjoyment of your own wit, which I think is is a thing I love in women that I know. You know, the refusal to be bored, which now I see that, I mean, you know, the irony is, of course, that I think there must be so many people who are very scared of me the way that I heard people were scared of Eunice. And I think a lot of it boils down to the fact, the refusal to be bored, which is, I think, what Eunice represented and probably transmitted to students who were being timid or boring her. And also the refusal to be boring, right? And that's very much present in Eunice's poems, I think. So I think these pleasures of the city, these pleasures of existence, the the confidence or the conviction, let me say, of writing about the life you've experienced, uh, very importantly also writing about relationships, love and sex in a different way. I mean, you hardly ever found that. Like when I was a young person, where did you find it about contemporary Indian life? Almost nowhere. I mean, Kamala Das used to like scare me because I used to feel like this is lots of heaving and sighing, and I don't think that my life is so melodramatic or so stylish, you know. But in Eunice's poems, I think at different ages and stages in my life, I could access different meanings, because she's also writing about that part of her life continuously through her life as a poet. And so I too have often found resonances or an understanding. And by poetry, I mean, of course, like, you know, the thing about Eunice's poems is I like them as much as I like Hindi film songs, because they are like little bits of your inner life given back to you, right, by the poet. So, and I think that the genealogy of finding your ancestors through art, like you are not the first person. You know, it's very fashionable now for young women to say, I'm the first person to have ever done this. You have to always be the first person, as if to say that you are Swayambhu, like nothing happened before you came. But the idea that you often think you're the only person, right? Nobody else knows this funny red and white awning place except me called Wayside Inn. Oh, wait, there were lots of famous poets there. So this finding your own self in something that came before you, looking very different, but it is the same. I think that's actually the beauty of poetry and lyric songs that you know I adore. So I'm going to read out a bit that I wrote about Eunice in a column that I wrote about Eunice and Meena Kumari soon after Eunice died, as women poets of the city, right, and women who wrote about love. As Vishnu opens his mouth and shows Arjuna the universe, as Hanuman rips open his heart and shows you his moral compass, so the artist, as woman in love, makes a poem and shows you yourself. Like Kali, she sticks out her tongue to taste the blood of desire, to tease you, to tell the truth. Because she promises no panacea, no compromise, we are both deeply compelled by the abandonment she suggests and terrified of abandoning predictability's privilege. The refuge she offers is pleasure and poetry. It takes a lot to inhabit that precarious home as she does. And I think for me, Eunice's work represents that, like her life and her work, which reflects that life, represents that courage to live in that world of pleasure, poetry, and what you feel, right? Not many people have the courage to do that. And I think women who choose not to be typical know this very well, that people are attracted to the kaleidoscopic enjoyments of living that life, to follow your bliss, as they say. But it's also a painful and difficult journey, and not many people have the courage to stick with that journey, right? And so, but nevertheless, I think like also that cold eye that sometimes Eunice brings to these things, which allows you the satisfaction of wrapping it up and knowing, that irony that your own painfulness comes from a certain structure. So at least at some level, there is for wonderful, I don't know the English word for it, but like a certain sanyam in the face of your own emotional experiences, right? So of course, I'm going to read two of Eunice's poems, which are very different, which are more the Bor Mat Karyar type of poems. Yeah. He speaks. Well, now tell me, what would you do to a woman who wrote to you saying, you haven't written for 3 weeks, you're the meanest man alive? Not even an exclamation mark at the end. And she sends telegrams and express letters saying it was a joke, love. It was a joke. I did what any self-respecting man would. I ignored her for a week. Her pleadings wore me down. She was an affectionate creature and tried hard, poor dear, but never quite made the grade. She would walk too close to me and then protest naively. How should lovers walk? Show me. Ridiculous too, her unseemly mirth when I said confidentially, I have such a hypnotic effect on women. Everywhere I go, they fall into my arms. Jamie Bond, she cried. My man is India's answer to Jamie Bond. After that pathological display, I decided there was only one thing to do, fix her. The next time we were making love, I said quite casually, I hope you realize I do this with other women. So, I think like for me, this poem always makes my hair stand on end because it captures a very big truth. It captures a very, it never undoes, like it never pretends the pain is not there, right? Like it's not ever flippant about pain, her poetry, but it, like that funny, harsh, not harsh, funny, uncompromising look at something. I've also seen it, like when I first encountered the Lavani dancers, I've seen it also in their performance and found it very attractive. So I think capturing that precarious place where there's an entire world that doesn't see women as full people expressing themselves, talking about all of life and their own lives as part of it, always trying to kind of box it up into places, and how you can disallow anybody else from deciding what your category is through this kind of very finely mixed set of emotions and expressions. And then of course, another poem, a short one to end what I'm saying. Famous one. For S, who wonders if I get much joy out of life. As a matter of fact, I do. I contemplate with a certain grim satisfaction dynamic men who sell better butter. Sometimes I down a Coke implacably at the Taj. This morning I terrorized successfully the bank manager. I look striking in red and black and a necklace of skulls. I love this poem because it's self-deprecating, but it's also deprecating S a little bit. And I like the idea of her terrorizing the bank manager. So yeah, I think the world in a way, in a very roundabout way that I've responded to your question, it's difficult to describe a world only through externals because there are too many crisscrossing worlds, and we can never say Bombay was X or Y because there were different Bombays. But if in the moment when there are many differences and those differences can crisscross each other, and we enter a city in that space, so we are going to encounter the unknown and become something new because we're encountering the unknown. I guess that is the poetic life in a way, and that is something that I feel Bombay offered in those years.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Paromita. That was so insightful. And what you said towards the end actually reminded me of you were talking about the woman's voice that she employs, and it reminded me of one of her poems that I just have to read. It's called "Transcend Self," you say, which I think is fantastic. It's a personally inspiring poem, and yeah, this is how it goes. Transcend self, you say. Connect with myth, history, the world crumbling around you. Men can and do. Beggars survive, destitute survive. There's something in this culture. Must ask beggars how they do it. Smart ass, poetess. Friend, the histories I know aren't fit to print. Remember Padma, widow at 17, forbidden to see the sun for a year, allowed to crap only at night when the pure were out of the way? The perfect book is one long cry in the dark. A novelist said that, who spent his life wondering why, when the Nazis came, his mother pushed him into the closet and let his sisters go to Auschwitz. I mean, in just such bare language, without being overly sentimental, there's so much. I have goosebumps at the end of this poem. There's her very economical use of language is so evocative. And as a student of poetry, that is something I learned. And apart from that, I wish you could read this poem. This is how it is. The line breaks in the middle, the space. I think that space is very important while reading poetry. It's an act of silence, and that silence, there's so much in it. So while reading it, it's a whole experience in itself. And this single line, smartass, poetess, and that just hangs there by itself. I mean, it's just so fantastic and so so insightful. And this leads to my other question for both Melanie and Paromita, which is, do you think, like taking Eunice's poetry as an example, do you think that there exists a direct relationship between the poet and the city? Is the term Bombay poet, quote unquote, a fair one? Melanie, since you are also known as a Bombay poet.
Well, I suppose one can never get away from where you are physically located. And where you are physically located inevitably influences in a kind of kaleidoscopic way that Paromita was describing. You know, the way you think about things, the way you view things, the way people view you. I mean, I grew up in Bombay. I was a Bandra girl. Yeah. And for me, going into the city as a student, and as Paromita said, you know, you never go into South Bombay unless it's for something specific. You know, I would go with my grandmother because she had a haircut in Colaba, and then we would go to Crawford Market for Faluda. And, you know, that was the trajectory of what I knew. And so, yes, I mean, I think you can't, there's that saying, you can take the girl out of Bandra, but you can't take Bandra out of the girl, or one way or the other. And I've not, I haven't lived there for, almost 40 years. And it's never left me. You know, some things, as a youth, take root in your psyche and, and grow there. And I think it was the same, for Eunice, despite having lived her youth in Pune, she transposed herself to Bombay in, complex ways. You know, it represented her life as a teacher, which was really important to her life as a poet, which was important to her life as a columnist, as a researcher at the university library. And I think that's where she located herself. And even towards the end, where she was very frail, and relatives would suggest that they take her away to Pune to look after her. You know, she said she'd rather be ill and lonely in Bombay than be well and bored in Pune. So, you know, that was her take on the city. And yes, so yes, yes and yes to your question.
I mean, I think, yeah, you know, I don't know if there is a technical description of what is a Bombay poet, right? I mean, there may be a kind of anthology or a list, but I'm sure it's an ever-growing one. I suppose one way of looking at a city and what art gets produced in it is, you know, is it all the work that was ever written or filmed from that city? I mean, there is something called a Bombay cinema, which is not the same as all of Bollywood anymore, right? So I think that I would say that there would be such a thing as a Bombay poetry. And yes, I think that time period and other things that have come after are part of that. And it would be well worth trying to define what is the nature of that work. Speaking for myself as a filmmaker, I feel that that I'm a Bombay filmmaker. Like I feel as a documentary filmmaker, I developed a language that is very particular to the fact that I lived in Bombay and to the fact that Bombay is a certain way and allows this very polyglot existence, right? Like I could make films which had lip sync songs in them and I didn't think twice about it. Nobody did that in documentary, but that was my experience of the city. And I felt able to merge it because the city was continuously mixing and remixing things. I mean, that idea of Bombay offering you continuous examples of many worlds coming together and going away, coming together and going away. If that's the structure of the city up to a certain point, then I think a lot of the work reflects those comings and goings. And maybe when the city ceases to be like that, a new type of work takes root over there, right? If today we think of cinema and cinema songs in the cinema, we do see that now it is pre-decided by people that films should be about small towns. They may be produced in Bombay or produced out of Bombay. So they may be about small towns or they have to cater to a kind of world cinema idea, even if it's located in Bombay. So just because the production is in Bombay, is the language of the film necessarily something that is emerging from Bombay or is of Bombay, rather, I would say? That's a question. I'm posing it as a question. I'm not saying it as an absolute description of anything. But I think it's a question one can debate because it gets to the heart of what is the meaning of things, right? Like meanings of things can't be so literal that it was made in Bombay, so it is of Bombay, but rather there's something else about the experience of the city and it's terrestrial, right? Or subterranean, as Eunice wanted to be in that home, the creature in that home, right? So that we are a city next to the sea, that we are a city where we travel by train. These are things that impact the way we look at the world. And I mean, for me, I was on the train over Mahim Creek, where the train always used to get stuck. When I heard a group of women singing in the first class compartment, darling, open the door, darling, open the door. Why are you angry so, right? And I will take you to Bandra and show you my Sandra. And I was like, who are these women? So I went and spoke to them to the Jali. And then many years later, when I made the film, I just asked them, what are your names? And they were like Philomena, and Philomena is the one I remember, but there were like many women, they were all secretaries. I asked them, how will I find you if I want to find you again? And they said, we always take the 808 Borivali fast from Malad station. So that was in 2001. And in 2006, when I made West Sandra, basically I went to Malad station and I was like, at 808, I was looking for some people and I could not see Philomena. So I went and asked some women in skirts and tops and little suits who looked like they were secretaries. And I said, do you know Philomena? They said, she retired. Who are you? And then we started talking. And so I'm saying like, now that is in my film. Now that's a very Bombay thing to happen, right? Like something different happens in different cities, I suppose. So yes, that's what I think.
Yeah, and for me personally, I have grown up in Bombay. I was born here and brought up here, and I went to school here, and I went to a convent school, and I did 2 years at Xavier's. So for me, the city also has its own language, and this language is something that I read in Eunice's poems. One particular one being Mrs. Hermione Gonzalez, and I have to read this poem because this poem cracks me up. I think it says a lot about her very unique voice and her ability to put her words to become another person's voice, which reminds me of Nissim Ezekiel's poems, The Railway Clerk, The Patriot, Goodbye Party for Pushpa TS. I feel like this is an ability for poets of the time to become other voices without seeming like they're mocking them or without seeming insulting, but just to speak a truth. Mrs. Hermione Gonzalez. Mrs. Hermione Gonzalez says, in the good old days, I had looks and color. Now I've only got color. Just look at my parents, how they married me to a dark man. On my own, I wouldn't even have looked at him. Once we were going somewhere for a holiday and I went on ahead. My hubby was to come later. And there were lots of fair Maharashtrian ladies there. And they all said, Mrs. Gonzalez, how fair and beautiful you are. Your husband must be so good looking too. But when Gonzalez came, they all screamed and ran inside their homes thinking the devil had come. Just incredible. I mean, this poem cracks me up. There's so much. There's a commentary on the Indian mentality of color. The language is so specific to perhaps the Goan Catholic community that I have heard growing up in Bombay. It speaks to, the private vocabulary of women themselves when they get together. But yet another thing I must focus on is, again, the incredible form, which speaks so much about her craft. If you read, and I wish you could read it, her line breaks are something that interests me so much, because the way it's written, and there were lots of fair Maharashtrian ladies there, and they all said, Mrs. Gonzalez, how fair and beautiful you are. Your husband must be so good looking too. But when Gonzalez came, that whole thing, each line has multiple phrases in it. And that kind of, I think that for me reads as how when we converse and, colloquially, how language spills out, we don't have full stops when we speak, and that is emulated. And I think that adds to the conversational tone of this poem, which is just incredible. I had to read it. That is a really fun. Sorry.
May I? I'm Dr. De Souza.
Okay, yes.
Sorry to button on this meeting. I was a good friend of Eunice for the last 7 or 8 years of her life. And I got to know her really very well. I must tell you that I'm thrilled and delighted that all of you remember her in such a vivid way. And I can tell you she was an absolutely fabulous person. Now, in her last book of poems, I got to know her really very well, because I'm also a De Souza, and in some way I was related to her. And she asked me to choose what I thought was her best poem. And well, I'm no great person in literature, so I selected Learn from the Almond Leaf. And her last book of poems was dedicated to me, and was Learn from the Almond Leaf. And when she passed away on the 29th of July, there was outpouring of grief the next day. But it was everything about the person rather than about Eunice. So 2 years later, I decided to set the record straight. And I wrote an article about Eunice, not only as a poetess and an author, but also as a person, a very vibrant person with very clear likes and dislikes. And I heard the lady before say, I think Mrs. Paromita talked, saying that the students were afraid of her. The students were not afraid of her. They were intimidated by her because she was really, really knowledgeable. And in her training in the UK and stuff like that, she actually interacted with the great Robert Graves, a very big author, and stuff like that. And he impressed, and she was the most knowledgeable person I've ever seen. And she could quote from here and then. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
And I asked her, I'm a little naive. So I asked her, who's your favorite author? And she would say, I don't have a favorite author. I have favorite books. And in the 7 or 8 years that I got to know her, and I got to know her really well, I learned so much literature, literally, sitting like the student sitting in front of the guru. So I'm thrilled and delighted that all of you remember her, because she was the most vibrant person I've ever known, and full of knowledge, full of funny stories, loved animals deeply. And I can tell you this, the most generous person I've ever seen. Generous, I mean, I can't tell you. She would fling purses of gold to anybody without counting the money and without expecting anything back. And she would act as if she just didn't care. But passionately fond of animals, to a point which I've never seen in a lot of people. An amazing, brilliant, lovely, fantastic person, was also a poetess, author, dog lover, generous person. And I can see that her legacy lives on, and I'm so very grateful and thankful that her legacy lives on in all these meetings. And I'm a doctor. I've taken time off to attend this meeting. And I cannot thank you all for saying these wonderful, wonderful things about her and her work, which is absolutely true. Thank you for giving me this opportunity for butting in on this meeting and saying this. And I'm very, very, I cannot tell you, my soul is so happy to hear Oliver talk about her in such a lovely and fascinating way. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Doctor. I mean, it's such a devastating time, the fact that you have taken time out, and thank you so much for sharing that. It's clear, I think, by what you said, and also by the number of people here, the impact that Eunice has had on generations, right? I thought she had the largest impact on poets, but clearly, I think everybody is drawn to her writing and to her work, and I'm so touched. Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, I wish we could talk about Eunice De Souza all day. I mean, I could do it for hours and days, but and we've been talking for a little more than an hour. Melanie, Paromita, do you have anything more you want to add? Any last few things to say?
No, I think we've said everything we need to say, and long live Eunice's memory, and long may she live in our hearts and our minds.
Judging by this meeting, I think she is alive and well, and she must be smiling down on us, talking about her like this. I know if she was alive and she heard us discussing her like this, she would laugh loudly in that gravelly voice of hers. I just remember as a lovely, beautiful, fantastic, amazingly generous and kind person who intimidated everybody by her knowledge. But once you got beyond that, you really got to see this amazingly kind and deeply concerned person who treated everybody so well. All the people whom she came in contact with, especially the poorest of the poor, the rickshaw driver, her bai, all remember in glowing tributes. And I thank you all for remembering her like this. It really thrills me. And I'm so very happy to hear Eunice, the person whom I love, to be discussed in such a way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I don't have anything to say. I mean, I think that everybody, I mean, I'm seeing all the people who've attended. It's great. Many of them I know are people who love poetry and are like, part of that genealogy of Eunice in a way. Please, those who haven't read should buy the books. They're easy to get on Amazon. And I do want to say that finally I did meet Eunice to interview her for my film, and she was not scary at all. She was really sweet and lovely. So yes. Yeah, that's how that story ended.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to end with a poem by Eunice, because I cannot think of anything else to say in my own words. This is The Road, and she wrote, it's for Deepak Anand. As we came out of the church into the sunlight, a row of small girls in first communion dresses, I felt the occasion demanded lofty thoughts. I remember only my grandmother smiling at me. They said, now she wears lipstick. Now she is a Bombay girl. They said, your mother is lonely. Nobody said even the young must live. In school, I clutched Sister Flora's skirt and cried for my mother who taught across the road. Sister Flora is dead. The school is still standing. I am still learning to cross the road. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Melanie, Paromita, Christopher, and to the 40 odd people who have taken time out to be here today. These are tragic times, but I hope that this hour has, I don't know, done something for you. It certainly brought me some sense of solace. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Be
Bye-bye.
safe, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Saranya, could I just say thank you so much for this, and hi Melanie, thank you for
Hi,
flagging
bye.
it up for me to. Yeah, I'm going to get stuck for words because it's just to say the whole 70s that was brought alive, through Eunice's poems. I was a student along with Melanie. She was the brighter and the best of us. But thank you so much for keeping the term Bombay. I think that's very significant about Bombay poetry and a particular, era that I think Eunice triggered off for a lot of us who continue in the world of words. So, but thank you. It was just amazing, and thank you, Melanie. You lifted a lot of fog of grief that one is walking through. It was very wonderful. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you again, Melanie. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Saranya. Speak soon.
Yes, keep in touch.